Part 2, Chapter 22 of If All These Young Men by Romer Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 2, London. Chapter 22, The Sad Hour. At 5:15 on the following Monday, Susan ran up the stairs to Blanchard's rooms. Her feet grated heavily upon the concrete steps, and she felt what an unutterable effort it was to go up. Blanchard himself opened the door and, smiling, said, "Come in," and led her into the big room where they had so often sat before. They stood in the middle of the room by the table with its green rep cover, and he began to talk at once. Through the open windows came the soft sound of traffic, and from time to time footsteps echoed across the court below, under the fresh green trees, and all the while pigeons cooed monotonously as if to lull the afternoon to sleep. The bright afternoon light poured down upon the gently waving tree-tops, which cast upward onto the ceiling of the room green shadows that changed like summer water in a shady stream. Presently Blanchard moved over to the window, and folding his arms crossed his feet, and leaned back against the wall with the dark green curtain behind him. His pipe was in his right hand, and every few seconds he raised it from his left elbow and held it in his mouth. When he had given it a hard puff, he moved it down again. Susan sat down in a chair and gazed out across the courtyard, and by reason of her social instinct kept apart in the conversation. Although Blanchard tried to talk cheerfully about subjects of no sentimental interest to either of them, he was distant and preoccupied, partly because he expected Amaryllis to come and take him out to dinner and the opera, and was afraid lest she and Susan should meet, and partly because he did not wish to give away the fact that he was in a state of emotion at seeing Susan again after their last interview. In a little while Susan said, choosing a moment unconsciously when he was off his guard, "James, I don't think it is any good our seeing one another any longer." Blanchard's face clouded. He was extremely vexed to have a scene of parting at this moment. "You must let me think about it," he said. Susan made no remark, and he gazed in front of him, endeavoring to find some words to protect himself from the storm that seemed suddenly to be gathering around him. He felt physically shocked, as if electric waves were directed upon him. He tried to break the tension by repeating, "You must give me time to think about it." "It is not any good," said Susan. "I cannot bear to go on any longer as we are doing." "I don't think you have the right," he muttered, "to ask me point blank to make a decision." Susan looked at him with wide open eyes, but without any joy. She was astounded to hear that he had still a decision to make. Blanchard looked at her. He was very vexed with her and aggrieved. He found that he was now asked, on the spur of the moment, to choose between two issues which had never been opposed. He had to say finally in words that he would marry her, or agree never to see her again. "Will you let me think about it till next week?" he said, looking at her with a troubled face. He suddenly became sad at heart and very unhappy. "It isn't any use going on like this, James," she replied. He sat down opposite her and stared inwardly in silence for about 5 minutes. He did not know what to do. Suddenly he said angrily, as if the ghost of some old fear had passed before his eyes, "I have an absolute right to my privacy." "Oh, but you need not shut me quite away," cried Susan, in whom his words awaked a familiar anguish. "I promised you," he said, as he had said so recently, "to tell you if I fell in love." Susan's face altered with pain, and there came out of her mouth the words, "Oh, James, you don't know how dreadful it is. I thought I could manage it, but you are so shut away from me, I don't know anything about you." The beauty of her voice entered James's heart. Neither pity nor love nor any of the outflowing emotions filled him, but he wished that he could liberate himself from a power which forced him against his happiness to sit there, unable to feel the wonderful emotions of the world. He did not want to marry Susan, he was sure of that, but he was also sure that his best self would have married her if it had been alive, but it seemed to be dead. He thought back for a minute to the beginning of their friendship. Certainly it was not his fault that Susan loved him, but nevertheless he felt at fault now, and though he had no reason to blame himself and could leave her quite cleanly, yet he was not proud of the part he had to act. He said to himself, "I am in a false position." Deep in his heart this seemed, however, not to be the case. Though he would have been acquitted before a jury of the world, Yet he was sure, as men and women are so often sure, that for some reason which he could not tell, life would put up a mark against him, and that in the book of judgment he would find, when one day he should turn its pages, that he had made a great omission. "If she loved me enough," he exclaimed to himself. This, however, did not avert the poetic disaster, and the thought went down into the moment and was lost. He tried to talk about the situation, but what he said was not in any way in harmony with the fact. Everything he said appeared to be a lie, for everything which is not finest love, though it is true of itself, appears a lie before love. There was no room now for anything but truth, and he did not know the truth. Only this thought came to him as a temporary reason for his attitude, and though he knew it was a makeshift, he used it to save himself against the unknown truth. "I don't want to tie myself up for life," he said to himself. At this moment the doorbell rang, and Blanchard was aware that Amaryllis had arrived. "The post!" he cried, starting up and going into the hall. He shut the door of the sitting room behind him, and Susan, sitting alone in horror, heard him say something in a muffled tone to somebody who answered in softer tones hardly any higher than his own. After a few seconds footsteps moved away, another inner door was opened and then shut, and before Susan had entirely realized that Amaryllis had come, Blanchard came back into the room. Susan knew now that Amaryllis was come, and as best she could she rose and said, "I think I will go now," but she never mentioned a word about what she knew. All Blanchard's best nature rose in him, but fate came down upon him, and though he was breaking with desire to be good to Susan, there issued from his lips only the words, "Shall I see you home?" It was over now. The moment had gone and was irrevocable. His passions fell down like shot from a burst shell, and he kept himself strung high enough to walk and talk only out of the absolute necessity of the moment. "It is not any good," she answered, and then added helplessly, "I think I had better go." She did not understand how she was able to rise from the chair, or to walk to the door, nor did he know how his hand opened it for her, or why he did not seize her in his arms and keep her back from going out of it, but he let her go. "It is no use," he said at the very last moment. "You see, I am no use. I am dead." "Don't say anything more," she begged him, in a voice that was not hers, but came through her from some distant place. It was strong and clear, and only by force of his utmost will, and by convincing himself of the futility of any of his actions, did he obey her. She hurried down the stairs because she did not wish to see the door swing into place and shut him off from her sight. When she was near the bottom, the sound of it shutting boomed down the concrete well of the stairs. When he had closed the door, Blanchard turned and saw Amaryllis. For one second he felt as if life were offered to him on reasonable and simple terms, but when he opened his mouth to speak, he said to his surprise, crossly, "Let us go out to dinner." End of chapter 22, recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.